The sun was a hammer, and the desert was its anvil. It beat down on the cracked earth until the very air seemed to shimmer with pain. In the center of that furnace, a young woman named Abigail Dawson was staked to the ground, a sacrifice to the blistering sky. Ropes dug into her wrists and ankles, so tight they'd already broken the skin. Her dress was ripped, her lips were split, and every breath she took felt like swallowing hot coals. The whole village was there to watch. They stood in a silent semicircle, their faces a mix of pity and grim satisfaction. This was justice, after all. This was the law. At the head of the crowd stood Silas Boone, a man whose authority was as sharp and unforgiving as a shard of rock. He didn't need the whip on his hip. The sun was doing his work for him. 3 days, Boone's voice boomed across the silence. If the heavens spare her, she is innocent. If she perishes, her guilt is proven by the sun itself. This is the way of our fathers. No one argued. They just nodded, their faces grim. To question the ritual was to question the village itself, and no one dared to do that. Abigail had been accused of stealing the village's gold reserves. A crime no one believed she was capable of, yet Boone's word was final. She'd denied it, screamed her innocence until her throat was raw, but it was like shouting into the wind. Now her voice was gone, reduced to a cracked whisper. "Please," she breathed, the word dissolving in the heat. "I did nothing." The villagers heard her, but they didn't move. They simply turned one by one and walked away, leaving her to her judgment. They left her alone with the sun and the buzzing flies and the silence of the empty desert. Hours crawled by. The world shrank to the burning of her skin and the frantic, shallow beat of her own heart. She was going to die out here. She knew it. But as the life began to fade from her, one single, stubborn thought remained. She would not die without her truth being heard. She prayed for someone, anyone, to find her. But this was Boone's land. Who would be foolish enough to cross him? And what kind of person could stand against a tradition held for generations? The sun began to dip, but the heat remained, a suffocating blanket. Just as she was about to surrender to the darkness, she heard it. The slow, steady crunch of hooves on dry earth. Through a haze of pain, she saw a figure on horseback, a man, tall and broad, sitting in the saddle like he was carved from the same stone as the mountains on the horizon. He moved with a quiet purpose, the kind of stillness that only comes from surviving things that would break other men. His name was Elias Carter. He was a rancher now, but the war had left its brand on him. He'd come back with more scars on his soul than on his skin, and he'd chosen the company of cattle over people ever since. He lived a life of deliberate silence, but that silence was shattered when he saw her. A girl, no older than his own daughter would have been, staked out like an animal. Her head lifted a fraction of an inch. "Please," she whispered, a sound so faint it was more breath than word. "Untie me." That sound hit Elias harder than any bullet ever had. He could have ridden on. Any sane man would have. Silas Boone's law was absolute in these parts, and interfering was a death sentence. But Elias had seen too many good people suffer because other men chose to look away. He'd lost his own family because of it. He wouldn't make that mistake again. He swung down from his horse, his boots sinking into the hot dust. He knelt beside her, his shadow offering the first relief she'd felt all day. Her eyes, wide with a terrifying mix of hope and fear, locked onto his. "You're innocent, aren't you, girl?" he asked, his voice a low rumble. "I swear it," she rasped. He didn't need to hear more. Elias pulled a worn knife from his belt, the steel glinting in the fading light. With 2 quick slashes, he cut the ropes on her wrists. The blood rushed back into her hands, and she let out a choked sob. He moved to her ankles and severed those bonds too. Then, with a strength that defied his years, he lifted her into his arms. She felt as light as a bundle of dry sticks. The desert had already taken its toll. He carried her to his horse, but they weren't alone. From a nearby ridge, two villagers watched, their eyes wide. They'd be running back to Boone before he'd even cleared the valley. Elias hadn't just broken a law. He'd committed an act of war against their entire way of life. He gently placed Abigail on his saddle. Her voice was a fragile thing. "They'll kill you for this." Elias looked back at the stakes, at the ropes lying in the dust. His jaw was a hard line. "Let them try." He swung up behind her, took the reins, and urged the horse forward, away from that place of cruel judgment. But they both knew this wasn't an escape. It was just the beginning. Boone was a man who ruled through fear, and he had just been openly defied. His vengeance would be swift and terrible. They had made it less than a mile when the shout cut through the evening air. "Stop right there, Carter!" Elias pulled his horse to a halt. He didn't have to turn to know who it was. Silas Boone stood on the path ahead, flanked by 4 of his toughest men. Boone's long coat whipped in the wind, his hand hovering over the butt of his revolver. "You think you can just ride away?" Boone sneered, his voice dripping with venom. "You just spat on the law of our fathers. You spat on this village." Elias sat tall in the saddle, Abigail trembling behind him. "That's not law, Boone. It's torture. And you know she's no thief. You just needed someone to pin it on." A cruel smile twisted Boone's lips. His men fanned out, blocking any chance of retreat. One held a thick club. Another drew a long, wicked-looking knife. Elias's hand drifted down to his own pistol, but he left it holstered. He knew this had to be handled another way. Suddenly, the man with the club charged, letting out a roar. Elias slid from the horse in one fluid motion, sidestepped the wild swing, and drove his fist deep into the man's gut. The club hit the dirt with a thud as the man collapsed, gasping for air. The second man lunged with the knife. Elias moved like a shadow, catching the man's wrist, twisting it with a sickening crack. The knife flew into the bushes, and a sharp elbow to the jaw sent the man down into the dust, unconscious. 2 down. The other 2 men hesitated, their confidence shattered. They looked to Boone, waiting for an order. Boone's hand tightened on his gun, his knuckles white. He stared at Elias, a new understanding dawning in his eyes. This quiet rancher was no ordinary man. He'd seen battle. He'd dealt death before. Boone was a bully, not a fool. He knew he couldn't win this fight, not today. He spat on the ground. "This isn't over, Carter," he hissed. "You and the girl, you'll pay for this. I'll see you both in the ground." He turned on his heel and stalked away, his defeated men scrambling to follow. The silence that fell was heavier than before. Elias took a deep, steadying breath and climbed back onto his horse. Abigail looked at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of terror and awe. They rode on without a word, the threat hanging between them like a shroud. Boone had been publicly humiliated. A man like that would burn the world down to get his revenge. They had escaped the sun, but they had just walked into the fire. Elias guided the horse into the dusty main street of the nearest town, stopping in front of the sheriff's office. Abigail was barely conscious, swaying so badly that Elias had to catch her as he helped her down. The door creaked open, and a man with a silver star pinned to his vest stepped out. Sheriff Thomas Hale. His face was weathered, his eyes sharp. "Elias Carter," Hale said, his voice slow and measured. "Haven't laid eyes on you since the war. Now you show up looking like you've wrestled a ghost, carrying a half-dead girl." "It was Boone," Elias said, and that one name was all the explanation Hale needed. The sheriff's face hardened into a mask of cold anger. "That man's been playing God for too long." They took Abigail inside, laying her gently on a cot. Hale examined the raw, bloody marks on her wrists. He shook his head. "She's lucky to be alive. We'll get her some water and food." "But belief ain't proof, Elias. Boone owns that village, body and soul. To bring him down, I need something solid. Elias met his old friend's gaze. He framed her for stealing gold. I'll start there, Hale promised. I'll check the ledgers, the transport logs. I'll talk to the traders who pass through his territory. If Boone is dirty, there's a money trail. Just give me some time. Elias trusted him. They had fought side by side in places that were still burned into their memories. That kind of bond didn't break. The next few days were a blur of quiet tension. Abigail recovered slowly in a small room adjoining the sheriff's office. Elias stayed close, bringing her food, sitting with her in silence as she regained her strength. She began to talk, telling him of her family, of the farm Boone had seized after accusing her. He, in turn, shared quiet, broken stories of the war, not of glory, but of loss. A fragile trust began to grow between them. One evening she looked at him, her eyes clear for the first time. "Why did you stop for me, Elias? You could have just ridden by." He was quiet for a long time. "Because I've lost enough people in my life," he said finally. "I wasn't going to stand by and watch another one get taken." But while they were finding a moment of peace, Boone was not idle. His influence stretched far beyond his village. Rumors and whispers followed Elias and Abigail like shadows. Traders who had once been friendly now turned away. The townspeople looked at them with suspicion. Sheriff Hale's investigation was hitting walls. Witnesses were suddenly too scared to talk. Records went missing. It felt like Boone's power was a web, and they were just now realizing how far it stretched. One night, as they sat in the small room, a rock shattered the window, a note tied around it. Elias unrolled the small piece of paper. The message was simple and chilling. "Give her back, or the town burns." Abigail's face went pale. "He's not just coming for us, is he? He's coming for everyone." Elias crumpled the note in his fist. He had thought bringing her here to the law would be the end of it. He was wrong. It was just another beginning. He had taken her from Boone's fire, only to bring her into a much larger one. And now the flames were starting to lick at the edges of the whole town. This wasn't just about one girl's life anymore. It was about everyone's. Sheriff Hale slammed his fist on his desk. "He's trying to start a war," Hale growled, staring at the crumpled note. "He knows I don't have the men to stop him if he brings his whole village down on us." Elias looked out the broken window. The street was empty, but it felt like 100 eyes were watching from the darkness. "He's not just trying to scare us, Thomas. He's testing you. He wants to see if the law will break." Just then, a deputy burst into the room, his face slick with sweat. "Sheriff, the livery! It's on fire!" Elias and Hale ran outside. At the end of the street, orange flames were clawing at the night sky, consuming the town's stable. The screams of trapped horses were a sound from a nightmare. It was a message, a clear one. Boone was showing them he could touch them whenever he wanted. He could burn their homes, destroy their livelihoods. He was turning the town against them, making them the source of everyone's fear. While the townspeople scrambled to fight the fire, Elias pulled Abigail aside. "This isn't safe anymore," he said, his voice low and urgent. "Hale's a good man, but he's outmatched. We have to go." "Go where?" she whispered, her eyes wide with terror. "He'll hunt us down." "He's hunting you for a reason," Elias said, his mind racing. "It's not about the gold. It was never about the gold. You saw something, or you know something, that he's terrified of. Think, Abigail, before all this happened, did you see anything out of the ordinary, anything to do with Boone?" She squeezed her eyes shut, trying to push past the trauma. "My father, before he passed, he was worried. He said Boone was making deals in secret. Late at night, he said he saw men, not from our village. Men with city clothes and hard eyes. They were exchanging crates. My father thought it was guns." Elias's blood ran cold. This was bigger than a village tyrant. Boone was running weapons. That meant he had powerful partners, partners who wouldn't want any witnesses. Where were these meetings? An old abandoned chapel south of here, she said. My father warned me to stay away. A plan, desperate and dangerous, began to form in Elias's mind. If we can find proof of what he's doing, we can bring him down. Not just for framing you, but for everything. But Boone will have that place guarded, she said. That's why we're not going to fight our way in, Elias replied, a grim light in his eyes. We're going to be ghosts. They slipped out of town under the cover of the chaos from the fire. They only had one horse and few supplies. They were fugitives, hunted by a man with a private army and, it seemed, a network that reached into the shadows of every town. As they rode, the world that had once seemed vast and open now felt like a cage, and the bars were closing in fast. They weren't just running for their lives anymore. They were running toward the truth, hoping it wouldn't be the very thing that got them killed. The abandoned chapel stood like a skeleton against the moonlit sky, a crumbling monument to forgotten faith. They left the horse hidden in a deep ravine and approached on foot, moving through the sagebrush like whispers in the dark. Elias had taught Abigail how to move silently, how to use the shadows. The skills he'd learned in the war were coming back to him, as natural and as terrifying as breathing. 2 guards were posted at the chapel's decaying entrance. They were sloppy, confident that no one would dare trespass on Boone's territory. It was a fatal mistake. Elias circled around the back, a hunting knife in one hand and a rock in the other. He tossed the rock into the brush on the far side. As the guards turned toward the sound, Elias emerged from the darkness behind them. It was over in seconds. 2 silent thuds and the guards were down, bound and gagged with their own bandanas. Inside, the chapel was filled with dust and the smell of decay. But in the center of the room, under the shattered remains of a stained glass window, were dozens of wooden crates. Elias pried one open with his knife. It wasn't filled with gold. It was packed with brand new rifles, gleaming in the moonlight. More than enough to arm a small army. But then Abigail gasped. She pointed to a symbol branded onto the side of the crate. It was a single stylized B. Not for Boone. "That's the brand of Bartholomew Thorne," she whispered, her voice trembling. "The railroad baron. He's been buying up all the land in the territory, forcing people out." The pieces clicked into place with horrifying clarity. Boone wasn't the king. He was a pawn. He was supplying a private army for the man who wanted to seize control of the entire region. The framing, the public punishments. It was all a smokescreen, a way for Boone to consolidate power and eliminate anyone who might get in the way of Thorne's ambition. Suddenly, a floorboard creaked behind them. They spun around. A man stepped out of the shadows of the confessional booth, a pistol aimed right at Elias's heart. It was Sheriff Hale's deputy. "You shouldn't have come here," the deputy said, his face pale with fear and regret. "Thorne has eyes everywhere." "You've been working for him all along," Elias said, his voice flat and cold. "The missing records, the warnings. You were feeding him every move we made." "He has my family," the deputy pleaded. "You don't understand. You can't fight him." "Get out of our way," Elias warned. The deputy's hand trembled, but he held the gun steady. "I can't. He wants the girl. He said she knows where her father hid the evidence." "What evidence?" Abigail asked, confused. Before the deputy could answer, the chapel doors burst open. Silas Boone stood there, a dozen of his men behind him, rifles raised. He had a triumphant, cruel smile on his face. "It seems the ghosts have been caught," Boone snarled. "The evidence, girl. Your father stole a ledger from Mr. Thorne, a record of all his payments, all his land grabs, all his murders. We know you have it. Give it to me, and I'll make your death quick." They were trapped, outnumbered, betrayed by the law and hunted by a force far more powerful than they had ever imagined. The truth they had been searching for had not set them free. It had just sprung the trap. Elias shoved Abigail behind him, his own pistol now in his hand. He was a soldier again, backed into a corner, with impossible odds. But there was one thing Boone and Thorne didn't know about Elias Carter. He was always at his most dangerous when he had nothing left to lose. "The ledger," Boone repeated, his patience wearing thin. "Now." Elias stared back, his eyes like chips of ice. "Let the deputy and his family go. Then we'll talk." Boone laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "You're in no position to make demands, old man." He gestured to his men. "Take them." As they surged forward, Elias acted. He fired not at Boone, but at the massive, rotting bell rope hanging in the chapel's belfry. The shot echoed like a cannon blast, and the thick rope snapped. The ancient iron bell, weighing hundreds of pounds, plummeted from the ceiling, crashing down directly where Boone's men were advancing. It hit the floor with a cataclysmic boom, splintering floorboards and sending up a choking cloud of dust and debris. In the chaos, Elias grabbed Abigail's hand. "Go! Out the back!" The deputy, seeing his chance, didn't hesitate. He turned and ran, disappearing into the night. Elias and Abigail scrambled out a back window as Boone's men coughed and struggled in the dust-filled darkness. They ran for the ravine, for their horse, for their lives. Gunshots erupted behind them, bullets splintering the trees around them. They were running blind, fueled by adrenaline, expecting a bullet in the back at any second. They reached the horse, and Elias threw Abigail into the saddle. As he swung up behind her, a searing pain shot through his shoulder. He'd been hit. He gritted his teeth, ignoring the fire spreading through his arm, and spurred the horse into a gallop. They rode hard, leaving the shouts and gunshots of Boone's men fading behind them. They rode until the horse was lathered and Elias was swaying in the saddle, his vision blurring. He finally pulled the horse to a stop in a hidden grove miles away. Abigail helped him down, her hands shaking as she saw the blood soaking through his shirt. "The ledger," Elias grunted, leaning against a tree. "He thinks you have it." "But I don't," she cried, tearing a strip from her dress to press against his wound. "My father never gave me anything." "Think, Abigail," Elias urged, his voice growing weaker. "A hiding place." "Something he gave you for safekeeping." "A locket? A book?" Her eyes widened. "My mother's locket. He gave it to me right before he died. He said to never, ever take it off." She pulled the small silver locket from under her collar. Elias took it with his good hand. It was heavier than it should have been. He found a tiny, almost invisible seam along the edge. Using the tip of his knife, he pried it open. It wasn't a picture inside. It was a minuscule, tightly folded piece of paper. On it, in tiny, precise handwriting, was a list of names, dates, and figures. It was Thorne's ledger, the proof. They had it. The weapon that could bring the whole corrupt empire down. But it was a weapon that had just painted an even bigger target on their backs. And Elias, the one man strong enough to protect her, was bleeding out in the middle of nowhere, with the wolves closing in. The bullet was lodged deep in his shoulder. Abigail did her best to clean the wound, her hands stained with his blood, but she knew it wasn't enough. He was growing weaker, his skin pale and clammy in the moonlight. If she didn't get him help, he would die. And if he died, she would be alone. "We have to get to a doctor," she said, her voice tight with panic. Elias shook his head, his breathing shallow. "No town is safe. Thorne's men will be everywhere." He pressed the tiny folded ledger into her hand. "You have to take this. Ride north, find Judge Miller in the capital. He's an honest man. I knew him before the war." "I'm not leaving you," she said, her voice fierce. A faint smile touched his lips. "Stubborn." He coughed, a racking sound that shook his whole body. "You have to. This is bigger than us now." She looked at the ledger in her hand, then at the man who had saved her life. He had walked into the fire for her, a complete stranger. She couldn't abandon him now. A new resolve hardened her gaze. She wouldn't run. She would fight. "There's a place," she said suddenly, remembering old stories her father used to tell. "An old mining camp up in the mountains. They say the people there don't trust outsiders, they don't trust the law, and they sure don't trust men like Thorn." It was a long shot, a desperate gamble, but it was the only one they had. She helped Elias back onto the horse, his body slumping against hers. She took the reins, guiding the horse not north toward safety, but up into the treacherous, rocky terrain of the mountains. Every step was a risk. Boone's men were hunting them. The land was unforgiving, and the man leaning on her was fading fast. The journey was a waking nightmare. They moved slowly, hiding by day and traveling by night. Abigail foraged for what little food she could find and gave Elias most of the water. His fever grew, and he drifted in and out of consciousness, muttering names from his past. In those fevered whispers, she learned of the wife and daughter he had lost to a plague while he was away at war, the guilt that had driven him into isolation. She wasn't just saving a stranger anymore. She was saving the man who had forgotten how to save himself. After 2 agonizing days, they found it. The mining camp was little more than a collection of ramshackle huts clinging to the side of a mountain, a place the world had forgotten. As they approached, figures emerged from the shacks, their faces hard and suspicious, rifles held loosely in their hands. An old woman with eyes that had seen too much stepped forward. "We don't want trouble here," she said, her voice like gravel. "He needs help," Abigail pleaded, gesturing to Elias. "He was shot. Please, I'm begging you." The woman's eyes scanned Abigail, then moved to the half-conscious man slumped over the horse. She saw the blood, the fever, the desperation. She gave a slow, reluctant nod. "Bring him in." They took Elias to a small cabin and laid him on a cot. The old woman, whose name was Martha, probed the wound with practiced hands. "I can get the bullet out," she said. "But he's lost a lot of blood. It'll be up to him whether he wants to live or die." For the next few days, Abigail never left his side. She held his hand through the fever, gave him water, and talked to him, telling him stories of her farm, of her parents, hoping her voice could be an anchor to keep him from drifting away for good. The miners, initially hostile, began to soften. They saw her devotion, her grit. They brought food, clean water, and stood guard at the edges of the camp. They were outcasts, and they recognized 2 of their own. On the 4th day, Elias's fever broke. He woke up, his eyes clear but weak. The first word he spoke was her name. Abigail. She wept with relief, her head resting on his chest. In that small, dusty cabin surrounded by strangers, they were no longer just a rancher and a fugitive. They were 2 broken people who had found something worth fighting for in each other. But their fight was far from over. One of the miners who had been scouting the lowlands returned with grim news. Silas Boone and his men were sweeping the area, searching every farm, every homestead, and they were getting closer. They knew their prey had gone to ground in the mountains. It was only a matter of time. Bartholomew Thorne wanted his ledger, and he was willing to burn the whole mountain down to get it. The news sent a ripple of fear through the camp. The miners were tough, but they were not soldiers. They couldn't stand against Boone's armed force. Many wanted Abigail and Elias to leave, to take the trouble with them. But Martha, the old woman, silenced them. "This ain't just their fight anymore," she declared, her voice ringing with authority. "Thorne's railroad will be the death of us all. He'll take our claims, our homes, just like he's done to everyone else. If we let Boone take these 2, we're just waiting for our turn to be next." Her words struck a chord. These people had been pushed around their whole lives. Now, the fight had come to their doorstep. A quiet, grim determination settled over the camp. They wouldn't run. Elias, still weak but with fire in his eyes, got to his feet. He was a soldier again, and this was his command. "They'll come up the main pass," he said, his voice raspy but firm. "It's the only way to bring horses. We can make our stand there." He drew a map in the dirt. He knew tactics. He knew how to use the terrain. The miners, who knew every rock and ravine, listened intently. They turned their mining tools into weapons. They set traps, rockfalls, dead ends, snares. They weren't an army, but they were people defending their homes, and that was a powerful force. Abigail stayed by Elias's side, reloading rifles, tending to the other miners. She held the ledger, tucked safely inside her dress. It felt like it was burning a hole through the fabric. Everything, the lives of these people, the future of the territory, Elias's life, it all came down to this single piece of paper. The morning came, cold and gray. A lookout horn echoed through the canyon. They were coming. Boone led his men up the narrow pass with arrogance, expecting a quick and brutal victory. What he found was a hornet's nest. The first wave of his men was crushed by a perfectly timed rock slide, orchestrated by the miners from the cliffs above. The rest were funneled into a narrow choke point where Elias and the best of the miners' marksmen were waiting. The canyon erupted into a symphony of chaos. Gunfire echoed off the stone walls. Boone's men, used to bullying unarmed farmers, were completely unprepared for organized, fierce resistance. They fell back in disarray, leaving several of their own behind. But Boone was furious. He regrouped, his face a mask of rage. He didn't care how many of his men died. He had to get that ledger. He ordered a second, more brutal assault. They used dynamite to blast their way past the choke point, advancing under a hail of bullets. The miners fought with incredible courage, but they were outgunned. They were being pushed back, foot by bloody foot. Elias, his shoulder wound screaming in protest, fought like a man possessed. He knew this was their last stand. In the heat of the battle, Boone spotted Abigail helping a wounded miner. His eyes locked on her. "The girl!" he roared. "Get the girl!" Two of his men broke through the line and charged at her. Elias saw them and tried to intercept, but he was pinned down. It was going to be too late. Abigail saw them coming, their faces twisted with hate. There was nowhere to run. She did the only thing she could. She pulled out her father's old pistol, the one Elias had taught her to use. Her hands were shaking, but her aim was true. She fired. One of the men staggered back, clutching his chest. The other one kept coming. He lunged, grabbing for her, for the ledger. Suddenly, a shot rang out from an unexpected direction. The man attacking Abigail collapsed, a neat hole in his back. Everyone froze. Standing on a ridge overlooking the battlefield was Sheriff Thomas Hale, and behind him were 24 armed men, not deputies, but grim-faced ranchers and townsfolk. The people who Boone had terrorized for so long. The deputy who had betrayed them, racked with guilt, had ridden not to Thorne but to Hale. He had confessed everything, and the sheriff, realizing he couldn't fight Boone alone, had put out a call to every man who had ever suffered under Thorne's boot heel. They had all come. Seeing Hale and his posse, Boone's remaining men lost their nerve. They threw down their weapons and surrendered. But Boone wasn't finished. In a final act of mad desperation, he broke through the chaos and lunged for Abigail, grabbing her and holding a knife to her throat. "It's over!" he screamed, his eyes wild. "Everyone back, or she dies!" Elias slowly lowered his rifle, his heart pounding in his chest. "Let her go, Boone! There's nowhere left to run!" "It ends with me, or it ends with all of you!" he shrieked, dragging Abigail toward the cliff edge. But he had underestimated her. She was not the same girl who had been staked out in the desert. She had faced death, she had fought in a battle, and she would not be a victim again. With a sudden, desperate surge of strength, she stomped down hard on Boone's instep and drove her elbow back into his ribs. He grunted in pain, his grip loosening for just a fraction of a second. It was all she needed. She twisted away from him, stumbling to the ground. Boone, enraged and off balance, was left standing alone at the edge of the precipice. He looked at Elias, at Hale, at the faces of all the people he had wronged, now staring at him with cold, hard justice in their eyes. He knew. There was no escape. With a final guttural scream of defiance, Silas Boone turned and threw himself from the cliff, choosing to meet his end in the jagged rocks below rather than face the judgment of the people he had terrorized. Silence fell over the canyon, broken only by the wind and the groans of the wounded. It was over. In the aftermath, Sheriff Hale and his men rounded up the prisoners. Bartholomew Thorne's name was on everyone's lips. With the ledger in hand, Hale had the proof he needed. The railroad baron's reign of terror was about to come to a very public end. Elias walked over to Abigail, who stood looking out over the canyon, the tiny piece of paper still clutched in her hand. He gently took it from her. "You did it," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "You saved us all." She looked up at him, her face smudged with dirt and gunpowder, and for the first time she smiled, a real, genuine smile. "No," she said softly, "we did it." They rode out of the mountains not as fugitives, but as heroes. The miners cheered for them. The townspeople who had once feared them now hailed them as saviors. The weight of the world felt like it had been lifted from their shoulders. They rode back to the village, the place where it had all started. The people there, freed from Boone's tyranny, were ready to build something new. Elias looked at Abigail, the desert sun glinting in her hair. He had ridden into her life to save her, but somewhere along the way she had saved him, pulling him out of the shadows of his past and giving him a future he never thought he'd have. Hope was a dangerous thing, but for the first time in a long, long time, he wasn't afraid of it. This story shows us that true justice doesn't come from old laws or powerful men. It comes from the courage of ordinary people who refuse to look away. It shows that one person's bravery can ignite a fire that burns down an entire empire of corruption. If you were moved by Elias and Abigail's journey, do me a favor and hit that subscribe button so you don't miss our next adventure into the heart of the Wild West. Now, I have a question for you all. When faced with impossible odds, what do you think is more powerful? A weapon or an idea? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. I'd love to hear what you think.